Imagine waking up one morning with a vague unease you can't quite explain. The room looks the same, the light falls on the furniture as it always does, and yet there is a heaviness in the air. You feel like someone has been living inside your skin, speaking with your voice, making choices in your name, and you're only now realizing it. You stare at the mirror, and for a split second, the reflection feels unfamiliar, as though another presence stares back at you. It isn't just you. It's something older, darker, and infinitely more patient. Carl Jung called it the shadow. Not a ghost, not a superstition, but the parts of yourself you've buried, denied, and pretended were never there. The jealousy you've condemned in others, the rage you've justified as just stress, the impulses you've mocked when you saw them in strangers, the fears that creep into your chest at night, the fantasies you would never admit to your closest friend. You tell yourself these things don't belong to you, and yet they do. The paradox is this: the more you insist on being a good person, the more violently your hidden side insists on being acknowledged. The more you chase light, the deeper the shadows grow. No matter how desperately you try to outrun it, the shadow follows, matching your every step. So here is the unsettling question. What if the self you have carefully built, the polite, rational, moral self, is only half of you? What if the other half has been shaping your destiny all along from behind the curtain? Look closely at the patterns of your life, the relationships that fell apart, the words you wish you could unsay, the sudden bursts of anger, the shame you carry like a secret wound. You tell yourself these were accidents, lapses, moments of weakness. But what if they were not accidents at all? What if they were the voice of the shadow, breaking through the mask you wear? Jung once wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." This means that denial doesn't destroy it, repression doesn't silence it. On the contrary, the shadow grows stronger the more you pretend it isn't there. Think about the hypocrisy you despise in others, the politician who preaches morality while hiding corruption, the celebrity who presents a flawless image while drowning in addiction, the friend who tells you they never lie but lies to themselves every single day. It's easy to see the shadow in them, harder to admit that you carry the same contradictions. And yet, don't you? When you tell a small lie to protect your image, when you envy someone's success and secretly hope they fail, when you look away from suffering because it inconveniences your comfort, these are not exceptions to who you are. They are who you are, just not the part you want others to see. But here lies the most disturbing paradox of all. The shadow is not only made of what is evil or shameful. Sometimes it contains the very qualities that could make you whole. Courage that was silenced in childhood, creativity dismissed as foolish, desire condemned as sinful, strength you were told was dangerous. Every time you exiled a piece of yourself to please society, family, or culture, that piece slipped into the shadow, and there it waits, shaping your life from the dark. So here you are, caught between two selves, the one you show the world and the one you refuse to acknowledge. You think you are steering the ship of your life, but what if the shadow has been charting the course all along? What if the conflicts you face, the choices you regret, and even the fate you meet are not accidents, but the shadow's hand guiding you? Imagine this. You could spend your entire life building a persona, successful, respectable, admired, yet, at the end, realize you never truly lived as yourself, because the half of you that was buried kept pulling you away from authenticity, leaving you divided, incomplete, restless. The great question then is this: can you ever escape your shadow? Or is the only way forward not escape at all, but confrontation? That question opens a door into territory few dare to walk, because to face the shadow is to strip away illusions, to admit you are not who you thought you were. Yet the alternative, denial, is far more dangerous. And so we stand here, at the threshold. The shadow waits, the mask trembles, and the journey into the depths of the human psyche begins. Why do we bury parts of ourselves? Why do we exile desires, impulses, and truths into the dark corners of the psyche rather than face them directly? The answer is not simple, but it is ancient. From the moment you entered the world, You were told what was acceptable and what was not. As a child, you learned quickly that some parts of you drew love, approval, and safety. Other parts drew scorn, punishment, or silence. You were praised for being polite, but scolded for being angry. Admired for being obedient, but shamed for being curious about forbidden questions. Rewarded for being agreeable, but rejected for being too bold. Piece by piece, you learned to carve yourself into fragments. You created a mask, a persona, to survive. Jung used that word deliberately. The persona was the face you showed society, carefully constructed to protect you. But everything that did not fit the mask, the wildness, the longing, the rage, the hidden brilliance, was pushed into the shadow. This repression is not merely psychological, it is also cultural. Every society demands conformity to certain values. Nietzsche once said, "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule." A culture decides what is sane, moral, or normal, and everything outside that narrow definition is branded deviant. To survive in such a world, you do not simply adapt, you amputate. You cut away the parts of yourself that could get you exiled, humiliated, or unloved. But here is the problem. The psyche does not forget. What you bury does not die. It waits. Jung compared repression to holding a beach ball underwater. You can keep it submerged for a time, but the pressure builds, and eventually it surges upward, often in ways you least expect. In sudden anger, addictions, failed relationships, obsessions, dreams that haunt you. The philosopher Schopenhauer believed that beneath our conscious life there is a blind, irrational will, a force that drives us whether we acknowledge it or not. He argued that suffering is inevitable because the will is never satisfied, always hungry, always pulling us in directions beyond our control. Jung's shadow resonates with this idea. The unconscious forces we ignore become the very currents that drag us through life. Think about addiction. Gabor Mate has argued that addiction is not about drugs or alcohol themselves, but about the pain we are unwilling to face. The substances are only substitutes, attempts to silence the shadow's voice when it grows too loud. We chase comfort because we are terrified of what will surface in the silence. The root is not chemical, but psychological, existential. The shadow calls, and we numb ourselves not to hear it. But repression comes at a cost far greater than temporary suffering. By denying the shadow, you deny yourself. Sartre called this bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to avoid freedom and responsibility. When you pretend you are only the mask, you become a stranger to your own depths. You may appear respectable, but inside, a war rages between what you show and what you hide. Why then do we persist in this denial? Because the alternative is terrifying. To confront the shadow means to face truths about yourself that shatter your self-image. To admit you are not purely good, not purely rational, not purely in control. To acknowledge the potential for cruelty, lust, envy, or selfishness within you, and beyond that, to face the unrealized potential you abandoned, the talents you suppressed, the power you feared, the love you never allowed yourself to give. We fear that by opening the door to the shadow, we will be consumed by it. This fear is ancient, encoded in myths and religions across history. The dragon guarding the treasure, the descent into the underworld, the temptation of the devil. These stories are metaphors for the same inner journey, the confrontation with the shadow self. The treasure is always there, but so is the monster. Modern society makes this confrontation even harder. We are bombarded with curated images of perfection, smiling faces on social media, success stories in self-help books, airbrushed models selling happiness. The message is clear: show only the light. But the more we censor our darkness, the more fractured we become. The result? A society of masks, everyone pretending, everyone hiding, everyone secretly tormented by what they dare not reveal. Jung insisted that this repression leads to projection. That is, we see in others what we refuse to see in ourselves. If you hate arrogance in others, ask yourself, is it because you deny your own need to be recognized? If you despise greed, is it because you secretly crave abundance but repress it as shameful? If you are disgusted by weakness, is it because you fear the fragility inside yourself? Projection makes the shadow visible, but only in distorted form, reflected through the faces of others. This is the hidden problem. You do not simply have a shadow. You are shaped by it every day. It chooses your relationships because you seek in others the parts you've denied in yourself. It dictates your obsessions because what you repress demands expression. It shapes your fate because the unconscious has a strange way of orchestrating life events that force you to confront what you've avoided. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That single line contains the entire tragedy of repression. We think we are free, we think we are rational, but in truth, the shadow drives the wheel. And we, the conscious self, are often little more than passengers inventing stories about why we took this road instead of that one. And so the question deepens. If repression creates suffering and denial breeds illusion, then what happens if the shadow continues unchecked? What happens when the denied self grows so strong it begins to take over entirely? The answer is not abstract. It is already happening, in the way societies implode with violence, in the way individuals collapse under addictions, in the way families repeat cycles of trauma. The shadow, ignored long enough, does not simply disappear, it erupts. But before we see how, we must first uncover the full weight of these consequences. Only then can we understand why facing the shadow is not optional, it is survival. The most dangerous forces in life are often the ones we do not see. Earthquakes brew beneath the ground, storms gather beyond the horizon, diseases spread silently long before symptoms emerge. The same is true of the psyche. The shadow, ignored, works in secret. By the time you notice its effects, the damage has already begun. Think about the moments in your life when you said, "I don't know what came over me." Maybe it was an explosion of anger that left someone you love in tears. Maybe it was a reckless decision you justified as spur of the moment. But deep down, you knew it was an impulse you'd been suppressing for years. That was the shadow speaking, the self you buried, finally breaking free. On a personal level, this can manifest as patterns you repeat without understanding why. You attract the same kind of relationships, partners who wound you in familiar ways, friends who betray you in similar patterns. You tell yourself it's bad luck, but in reality, your shadow is pulling you toward the familiar, even if it hurts, because what you repress, you unconsciously seek. The psychologist Sigmund Freud, though often at odds with Jung, observed something similar in what he called the compulsion to repeat. Trauma replays itself until it is acknowledged. Jung would say, the shadow finds ways to be seen, even if it means sabotaging your life. But the consequences stretch far beyond the individual. Consider society itself. The violence, corruption, greed, and hysteria we see in the world are not random. They are collective shadows made visible. A nation that preaches freedom while quietly perpetuating oppression. A culture that glamorizes happiness while drowning in antidepressants. An economy that celebrates abundance while millions starve. These contradictions are not coincidences. They are the shadow of entire civilizations breaking through the mask. History is filled with terrifying examples. When entire societies deny their shadow, the result is not peace, it is catastrophe. Germany in the 1930s denied its humiliation and rage after World War I, only for that shadow to explode into one of history's darkest chapters. America, built on ideals of liberty, long denied its shadow of slavery and systemic racism, and that denial continues to haunt it. Every culture has its repressed truths, and the longer they are denied, the more violent the eruption. The same principle applies to individuals. Repressed anger can become illness. Gabor Mate has written about the link between unacknowledged emotions and physical disease. The body keeps the score of the shadow's silence. Depression, anxiety, addiction. They are not random disorders, but the psyche's way of signaling that something buried demands recognition. Even our daily behaviors betray the shadow's hand. Why do we gossip about others' flaws? Because we cannot face our own. Why do we crave distraction? Endless scrolling, constant enter. While the real you waits in silence. The cost is authenticity. You may succeed in the world's eyes, but inside you feel hollow, because the person who is praised is not the person who truly exists. This hollowness is not rare, it is epidemic. People with careers, families, and status confess they feel empty, like actors in a role they never chose. Jung would say this is the inevitable result of a life lived without integrating the shadow. Without it, wholeness is impossible. You can be successful, but never complete. And so the shadow becomes both the destroyer and the key. Ignore it, and it undermines your life in unseen ways, through illness, sabotage, projection, and despair. Face it, and it reveals the path to authenticity. This is the cruel paradox. The very thing you fear holds the very thing you need. But here lies the turning point. If the shadow is inevitable, if it cannot be destroyed, if repression only makes it stronger, then what is left? Escape is impossible. Denial is fatal. The only path remaining is rebellion. Not rebellion against society alone, nor rebellion against others, but rebellion against the self you thought you were. A rebellion that dares to confront the dragon, to descend into the underworld, to claim the treasure guarded by darkness. And so we arrive at the precipice. The rebellion begins not outside, but within. But how do you break free from something that lives inside you? How do you fight the shadow without becoming it? The answer demands courage few are willing to summon. But for those who do, the reward is nothing less than the transformation of the soul. If the shadow cannot be escaped, if repression only deepens its grip, then the only true rebellion is to turn toward it. Not to destroy it, because you cannot, but to integrate it, to weave it into the fabric of who you are. This is not a comfortable idea. Most people would rather die defending their mask than face the darkness behind it. And many do. Carl Jung warned that integration requires the courage of a warrior and the humility of a pilgrim. It is not an intellectual exercise, it is a descent, a confrontation with what you have spent a lifetime avoiding. But how does this rebellion begin? It begins in the silence you fear. Most people fill their lives with noise because in the quiet, the shadow's whispers become audible. To rebel is to stop running, to sit in the stillness and let the shadow emerge. This might come as recurring dreams, sudden emotions, disturbing fantasies, or uncomfortable truths about your past. Jung believed dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, not merely random images, but messages coded from the parts of you you've exiled. To dismiss them as nonsense is to miss the shadow's attempt to speak. The rebellion also requires honesty, radical honesty. To admit to yourself the thoughts you condemn in others. To write down, without censorship, the feelings you pretend not to have. To confess, even in private, the desires you hide. This honesty is painful, but it is also liberating, because the moment you name the shadow, it begins to lose its power over you. Consider the myth of the hero descending into the underworld. Whether it is Orpheus seeking Eurydice, Dante guided through hell, or Christ facing the desert, every tradition carries the same structure: descent, confrontation, transformation. The treasure is never found on the surface. It is always guarded by the dragon. The shadow is that dragon. Your rebellion is to face it without flinching. But facing it is not the same as indulging it. Some misunderstand Jung, imagining integration as giving free rein to destructive impulses. That is not integration. That is possession. To be possessed by the shadow is to become its puppet, consumed by rage, greed, or lust. Integration means something far more subtle. To acknowledge these impulses, to understand them, and to channel their energy into conscious expression. Think of anger. Repressed, it festers into bitterness or erupts in violence. Indulged blindly, it destroys. But integrated, anger becomes strength, the capacity to defend, to set boundaries, to stand against injustice. The shadow's energy, when owned, becomes fuel. Jung believed that in the shadow also lies our unlived life, the talents, passions, and potentials we suppressed. To rebel is to reclaim them. Perhaps you were told as a child that your creativity was foolish, so you buried it. The shadow holds it still. Perhaps you silenced your ambition to avoid being judged as arrogant. The shadow waits with it. Perhaps you repressed your tenderness because vulnerability was mocked. The shadow remembers. To integrate is to bring these gifts back, to live the life you secretly longed for, but were too afraid to embrace. History shows us what happens when individuals dare this rebellion. Nietzsche, though consumed by his own demons, declared, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." He meant that creativity, greatness, and transformation are born from the very chaos we fear. Jung himself, through his confrontation with his unconscious, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, produced the Red Book, a work so intense he kept it hidden for decades. It was his personal rebellion, a map of descending into his own darkness and emerging with insights that would change psychology forever. But rebellion is not a solitary act of willpower. It is also a shift in relationship with yourself, with others, with the world. To face your shadow is to stop projecting it onto others. When you recognize that the arrogance you hate is also in you, you become less judgmental. When you realize that the weakness you despise is part of yourself, you grow more compassionate. The rebellion against the shadow births empathy because you no longer need to demonize others to protect your fragile mask. This shift is revolutionary. A society of people willing to face their shadows would be a society far less violent, far less hypocritical, far less enslaved to illusions. The wars we wage against others are often displaced wars against ourselves. If we ended the war within, the world outside would begin to change. But do not mistake this for an easy victory. Jung warned that integration is a lifelong task, not a one-time epiphany. The shadow is not tamed once and for all. It shifts, evolves, adapts. Every new stage of life brings new aspects of yourself that must be faced. The rebellion is ongoing, and it is costly. To rebel against your own illusions means sacrificing comfort, certainty, and the approval of others. People may not understand you. They may call you selfish, strange, even dangerous, because when you integrate your shadow, you stop playing the roles society expects. You live more authentically, and authenticity is always threatening to a world built on masks. But what is the alternative? To live safe but hollow. To cling to approval while secretly tormented by the self you refuse to know. Jung would argue that the cost of repression is far greater than the cost of rebellion. The mask may earn applause, but only integration brings wholeness. So the rebellion is not against the shadow itself. It is against your own fear of it, against the lie that you are only your persona, against the comfort of ignorance, against the illusion of escape. And when you rebel, when you finally face the shadow not as an enemy, but as a part of yourself, something extraordinary happens. You begin to glimpse a deeper truth, that the shadow is not the end of your journey, but the gateway. Beyond it lies a revelation that changes everything. After all the struggle, after the descent into the unconscious and the confrontation with the shadow, arrive at a revelation so radical that it overturns everything you thought you knew about yourself. At first glance, you believed you were your persona, the mask you wear, the role you play, the story you tell. Then you discovered the shadow, the hidden, repressed parts you denied. But Jung's deepest insight is this: you are neither the mask nor the shadow. You are something larger, something vast, something he called the self. The self is not the ego. It is not your conscious identity, your name, or even your memories. The self is the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and dark, past and future. It is the center and the circumference at once, the still point around which your entire psyche turns. And here lies the ultimate truth. The journey into the shadow was never about defeating darkness. It was about becoming whole. For wholeness is not perfection. Wholeness is integration. To be whole is to stand in the paradox of being both angel and beast, creator and destroyer, noble and shameful all at once. Most people spend their lives trying to escape contradiction, chasing purity, clinging to ideals. But the human being is not pure. The human being is a tension of opposites, and to deny this is to live fractured. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The light is not achieved by rejecting darkness. It is born by embracing it. The ultimate truth is that peace is not the absence of conflict within you, but the reconciliation of it. Think of the ancient symbol of the yin and yang, black within white, white within black. The opposites are not enemies, they define each other. Light only exists because of shadow. Order only exists because of chaos. To be whole is to carry both, consciously, without being possessed by either. This realization transforms suffering itself. Up until now, suffering seemed like an enemy, a punishment, a flaw in existence. But in Jung's vision, suffering is the crucible. It is the pressure that forces you to see what you would rather not see. It is the fire that forges integration. Without suffering, there is no descent, no shadow, no transformation. To run from suffering is to run from the very path that could set you free. The final truth also dismantles the illusion of control. Your ego, the little I you thought was in charge, is revealed as only a fragment of the psyche, a fragile island floating on a vast ocean of unconscious depths. The self is that ocean, and here is the humbling realization. You do not own your life. You are lived by something greater than you. This greater something is not outside you. It is within you, yet beyond your conscious grasp. Jung often described it in almost spiritual terms. For some, the self feels like God. For others, like destiny. For still others, like an inner guide, wiser and more ancient than the rational mind. Whatever name you give it, the experience is the same. A recognition that your life is not random, that your suffering, your conflicts, your shadow, all of it is part of a deeper unfolding, a pattern woven into existence itself. This realization does not make life easier, but it makes it meaningful. You may still feel fear, grief, rage, or despair, but instead of seeing them as mistakes, you see them as threads in the larger tapestry. And meaning, Jung insisted, is what the human soul requires most. Without meaning, life collapses into nihilism. With meaning, even suffering becomes bearable. But the final truth carries one more weight: responsibility. Because once you see the self, once you glimpse the totality of who you are, you can no longer hide behind excuses. You can no longer say, "That wasn't me." It was you, the whole of you. The shadow is yours. The persona is yours. The choices, conscious and unconscious, are yours. And this responsibility is terrifying because it means you are accountable not only for your light, but also for your darkness. Yet in this responsibility lies liberation. You no longer need to project blame endlessly onto others. You no longer need to pretend you are a victim of fate alone. You become a co-creator of your life, a participant in the unfolding of the self. And this is the deepest kind of freedom, not the childish freedom of doing whatever you want, but the mature freedom of becoming who you truly are. This is why Jung called individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, transcending the ego, and realizing the self, the greatest task of human existence. It is not for the faint of heart. It demands everything. And yet, it is the only path that leads to peace, not the shallow peace of avoiding conflict, but the profound peace of embracing the whole of your being. Imagine standing at the end of this journey. The persona still exists. You still have a role to play, a mask to wear, but you no longer confuse it with your essence. The shadow still exists. You still feel envy, anger, desire, fear, but you no longer need to repress it or be possessed by it. And beyond both, you feel the quiet presence of the self, the vast, timeless center of your being, watching, guiding, holding all things together. This is not a state of perfection. You are still human. You will still stumble, fail, hurt, and be hurt. But now, each fall becomes part of the path. Each contradiction becomes a revelation. Each wound becomes a doorway. The ultimate truth, then, is simple but shattering. You were never meant to be perfect. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness is not found in escaping your shadow. It is found in embracing it, fully, consciously, courageously, until you realize that the very darkness you feared was the gateway to the light you sought.